If you've read through the book of Ezekiel, which I hope you have, I hope that you've read through it multiple times. But if you've gone through a Bible reading plan and you've read through Ezekiel, you know right off the bat that the book of Ezekiel is different. Now, when it comes to books of prophecy, they can all be kind of different. They can all be challenging. Isaiah is not an easy book. Jeremiah, while perhaps easier to understand, is kind of a hard book because it's such a dreary message. Other books later on, like Daniel, or at least the latter half of Daniel, have some very strange, difficult to interpret visions, as do some of the latter prophets. But when we get to the book of Ezekiel, one of the main words that really comes to mind is strange. From the opening vision that we'll talk about here in just a moment, to some of the things that Ezekiel is called to do, to some of the messages that he speaks, to even his final revelation or his final vision, there's just an oddity about this book. And yet, I think that this book is a wonderful and a beautiful book. And maybe that's because I'm odd. Maybe I'm strange. But I think that there are some incredible lessons. There are some powerful lessons in this book, some good reminders. Ezekiel was not a soft preacher. He preached messages that were hard on the people. And if we're honest, sometimes we probably need those lessons that they needed back then. Ezekiel's life is one that in some ways to me is very sad. And yet in other ways, it's very encouraging and very hopeful. And we may talk about that a bit more at the end. But also the book of Ezekiel, while it is a book of judgment and it is a book of warning, it is a book of punishment and consequences, it is also a book of incredible hope. There's some of the most lifted and elevated scenes of hope and future glory that you will read in all of the Bible are found in the book of Ezekiel. Cecil talked about one of those passages Sunday, that vision of the valley of dry bones. I know that sounds weird, and if you really think about it, what a strange vision that must have been for Ezekiel to have this experience of walking through a valley of skeletons and seeing them brought back to life. But the message that was portraying was an incredible and a beautiful message. And there are those throughout the book of Ezekiel at certain points. And so I hope that our lesson this evening, this overview, encourages you, if you're not familiar with this book, if you haven't spent some time in it before, to maybe spend a little bit more time in it in the near future. So let's just start off with some of the background information, as we typically do with these overview studies. And let's talk about the man who this book is named after, the prophet Ezekiel. We don't know hardly anything about Ezekiel, and what we do know is only found in this book. We don't find him in other places in the Old Testament. We don't find other parts of Scripture that reveal to us some of his background or much of his life. And so there's just a few glimpses of details of who he was and what his life was like that we read in the beginning, and then interspersed at a few points throughout his letter. But we find that he was the son of a man named Buzi, and that his father was a priest, and that he would have been a priest as well, or he should have been a priest, but he really never got the chance to do that. You see, he was exiled to Babylon probably during the second deportation. If you remember, and I don't know how well this shows up. I know that's kind of small, so I apologize for that. But around 605 BC was when Nebuchadnezzar deported some of the first hostages. That was the first deportation. Daniel was a very young man, maybe a teenager, and other princes and high-standing people were taken away as captives, really as hostages, to ensure the compliance of the king in Judah as a vassal of Babylon. And so in 605, they were taken off to Babylon. But then in the ensuing years, and we've gone over some of this history before, so I won't go through it again, but there's a lot of tumult, there's a lot of upheaval in the nation of Judah in Jerusalem. This is where a lot of Jeremiah's prophecy is taking place. He is in Jerusalem. He is trying to teach Zedekiah to listen to what the Lord has to say, but there's rebellion. And what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes back in around 598 or 597 BC, And he takes some more captives. About 10,000 people are taken as captives out of Jerusalem. And he takes, I believe it is Jehoiachin is the ruler at that point. He takes him in captivity back to Babylon. And apparently Ezekiel was probably taken within that group. And he would have been about 25 years old when that happened. And so then after that is when Zedekiah is made king. But it's in this period before the actual final fall of Jerusalem, and when that second deportation, that Ezekiel is called to ministry. Now the book opens, and well, let me talk about the geography just real quick. So he's been carried off captive over here. He's going to end up in this little area called Tel Aviv. It's basically a refuge city, probably an agricultural area. As these Jews were brought over to Babylon, they were probably put in places where they could work and be productive for the Babylonian Empire. So they're basically in this refugee area along what's called the Kibar River, which wasn't really a river, it was a canal. And so there we read about him being by the Kibar Canal in the city. So he is a long, long way from home. And we're told that he's 30 years old at the time of his first vision. Now, the book of Ezekiel is very well documented time-wise. The first thing that we get is, it says in the 30th year, and it's supposed that is probably speaking of Ezekiel's 30th year, because then right after that, he speaks about the 5th year since Jehoiachin had been carried into captivity. And so Ezekiel himself has been a captive, has been in Babylon for about 5 years, and he is 30 years old. So he would have been taken off when he was about 25 years old. Now, something that's at least interesting about this is if you go back, I think it's in Numbers chapter 4, you find that for a priest, for someone who was born into the priestly family, they typically would have started their priestly duties when they turned 30, the men would. And they would work as a priest until about the age of 50. If you look at the dates of the way Ezekiel puts together his visions, his first vision comes when he is about 30. So right around the time that he should have been starting his work as a priest in the temple back in Jerusalem, that life has been ripped away from him. What he had always planned on being, a priest for God, that idea, that dream was taken from him as he was taken as a captive to Babylon. But instead, God's going to use him as a prophet. And about the same time he would have started his temple service, he receives his first of several visions that God is going to send to him, and God is going to begin using him. By the way, if you do the math from what I've read, his final vision, which is, by the way, a temple vision that we'll talk about here in just a little while, came when he was about 50 years old. And so this priest, this man who should have served as a priest from the ages of 30 to 50, that was taken away. Instead, God used him as a powerful prophet in that time frame. And we may make a couple more remarks about what we can learn from that towards the end of the lesson. But anyway, we do find that that Ezekiel was married. We don't know much about his wife other than in the 9th year of the exile, she dies. And actually that is used as an object lesson for not only Ezekiel, but for the people. And so Ezekiel's life was not an easy one. There were some very hard things he had to do. There were some hard things that he experienced when his wife died. He was told by God that he could sigh inwardly, but he was not to display any type of emotion to the people around him. That was an object lesson of the fact that basically Israel, Jerusalem, was getting ready to fall, and that God was going to let his bride, he was going to let his beloved people perish. So that's not an easy lesson to live out, but Ezekiel does that. And like I just said, he was about 50 when he sees his final vision. But beyond those mere details, we don't know much about this man, so we only have his work to go off of. So let's talk about the outline. The book of Ezekiel is thankfully one of those that's pretty easy to outline. Most times when you read a commentary, if you read several commentaries, you'll get several outlines of most books. But the book of Ezekiel, most people pretty much agree on the basic outline. There's, of course, always details and minute areas of interest that might differ. By and large, most people follow an outline similar to this. In the first 3 chapters, we have Ezekiel's commission. So this is the opening vision and what God says to Ezekiel as he calls him to prophetic service. And then chapters 4 through 24 are all going to be primarily messages of judgment on Judah. Now, there's going to be interspersed in here some messages of hope, some promises of a remnant, but by and large, this section is all about the problem with Judah. Now, you might think, well, haven't they already suffered? Haven't they already been taken into exile? Well, yes, partially. They had the first deportation of a few people and then the larger deportation, but Jerusalem is still standing, and there's still people in the city. And like I said, Zedekiah is reigning, and Jeremiah is trying to prophesy and warn those people. But even though they had been defeated by Babylon, even though they were vassals to Babylon, even though some had been carried away captive, Israel, Judah, has not truly repented. In fact, we're going to see the depth of some of their depravity in the book of Ezekiel. And so Ezekiel's message is the judgment's not over. In fact, the worst is yet to come. And many people thought that, this exile was going to be short-lived. There were false prophets that were saying the yoke of Babylon would be cast off and the exiles were going to come home soon. And Ezekiel's message is absolutely not. In fact, Ezekiel has a terrifying message. The people place their hope in Jerusalem. This is the city of God. This is the city that has always stood. The temple's here. And Jerusalem's not going to be standing for much longer. And building up through chapter 24, Ezekiel is giving messages that Jerusalem itself is going to be destroyed. And then after that, we'll see messages of hope at the latter portion. Now, in between those two, chapters 25 through 32, as happens with many of the other prophets, Ezekiel has some words of judgment and condemnation towards other nations as well. God used some of the nations to punish Judah, but he wasn't going to overlook the wickedness of those other nations. And so there's messages against them as well. And then the final portion of the book, chapters 33 through 48, after the fall of Jerusalem, Jerusalem has fallen, the temple is destroyed, the people are decimated. But from the ashes of this rubble heap comes messages of hope. Now, there's still warnings in this section. Just as there's hope interspersed in that section about judgment, there's still warnings and problems interspersed in this section as well. But we find a larger focus on hope and on restoration and on God's plans for the future of his people. And if I was going to change something of this outline, it would be this, and that it would simply be to break this last part up, 30, and we'll kind of talk through it this way. 33 through 39 are really the messages, and then chapters 40 through 48 are a big section of the book. They are all about Ezekiel's final vision, which is a vision of Jerusalem and a new temple. It's very detailed, and it sounds very strange to us, but we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. So let's just go through these sections and kind of give some of the high-level details about the book, about the contents of this book. When you open up and you read Ezekiel chapter 1, you will read perhaps one of the strangest chapters, maybe in most of the Bible. Ezekiel is by the river or by the canal Kibar, and suddenly he begins to hear a great wind. He looks up and there is a storm cloud approaching from the north. This is clearly a supernatural vision. This is a supernatural storm that he is witnessing. There is fire or lightning flashing constantly from this great cloud. And then out of this cloud, there come 4 living creatures, is what Ezekiel calls them. And he describes their appearance. They have multiple sets of wings. They have 4 different styles of faces. They are very strange beings. Now, we find out later in the book of Ezekiel, he says that he knew that these were cherubim. And whether this depiction is meant to be the literal, actual depiction of what cherubim, a type of angel, looked like, or whether Ezekiel was just doing his best to explain something that his mortal mind was having a hard time wrapping itself around, really doesn't matter. He sees four heavenly beings that turn out to be cherubim. But also, along with them are four sets of what is called wheels within wheels with eyes all around. Now, this is an artistic depiction of what someone tries to think of. Whether that's what the wheels within wheels look like or not, we have no idea. People have all sorts of ideas. Some people have suggested that these are UFOs. I've had conversations with people that say Ezekiel talks about UFOs. I don't think Ezekiel talks about aliens and UFOs. These are wheels that probably depict a type of chariot, I think, because they are next to the four living. There is a set of these wheels with each of the four living creature, and Ezekiel talks about their movement and how they can move. And any time that they move, the wheels move and the living creatures move, and they can go in any direction at all that they want to. But then, while that's all fascinating and strange and bewildering, above the four living creatures, something else begins to appear, and he realizes that it is a throne. And on the throne sits another being. And this being has a human appearance, but if you read the description, it is certainly a being who is something far more than human. Again, Ezekiel I think he's doing his best to describe this being. He talks about his waist looking like metal, but also fire and color. And it is a picture, he tells us then later, of the glory of God. Verse 28 of chapter 1 says, "Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of God." Now, that may all sound well and interesting and strange, but I think this is important for Ezekiel, and it's important for the people of Israel, especially back then. Remember where God's glory is supposed to be. God's glory is supposed to be in the most holy place of the temple, back in Jerusalem, well over 1,000 miles away, correct? That's where you would think. And yet, here is Ezekiel, perhaps despondent and depressed to be so far away from the temple he was supposed to serve in this land of foreigners and pagans and idolaters, in this land that seems so far away from God. But Ezekiel is taught something that maybe we take for granted. God is not confined to a temple. He's not confined to a city. Is not confined to a geographic area. God is just as present in Babylon as he was in Judah. Now that's a message of comfort for anyone who is faithful, like Ezekiel. It's a message of warning for any of those who are not. They may have thought that they were no longer in Judah where God was. God is present to judge the exiles who are rebellious just as much as he was when they were back in Jerusalem. But then the real key is, from this being that's on the throne, this great vision, a voice comes. And that voice, you can't underscore enough the importance of the Word of God. All the way back from the beginning of the Bible, emphasis is put on the Word of God. How does God create the world? His Word. When God speaks, it is powerful. And as amazing as this scene is, of these cherubim and these wheels and the Spirit of God and his throne and his glorious appearance, the real key is there is a voice that speaks. And again and again and again throughout the book of Ezekiel, God says, "Here is the word of the Lord." And Ezekiel is to give the word of the Lord. This is also demonstrated in one of the next strange aspects of the scene. In chapter 2, God speaks to Ezekiel and he tells him what he's going to do. He's sending them to Israel. And Cecil talked about this some Sunday, and he warns him. He says, "You're going to go to Israel. I'm sending you to Israel, but you have to know this is a stubborn and a rebellious people. They always had been, and they still were." Just think of Moses and all of the problems that they had. Think of all the tragedies we've talked about in our Sunday night series, going through the historical books of the Bible, all the incidences of rebellion and stubbornness, and they still are. And yet still God is going to send Ezekiel. And he commands Ezekiel to not be afraid of them. Instead, he is simply to go and faithfully preach what is taught. Faithfully give the word of God. Whether or not the people are going to listen to Ezekiel is not his concern. His concern is to be courageous and to obey. By the way, As strange as chapter 1 may be, with this scene of cherubim and wheels and this glorious figure on a throne, chapter 2 and 3, everyone needs to go home. And especially if you're a church leader, especially if you're a parent, go home and read chapters 2 and 3. Because that's where God calls and commissions Ezekiel, and it's an incredible passage. He sets up Ezekiel as a watchman. And he tells Ezekiel, you're going to be like a watchman on the wall. Now, if a watchman sees an invading army, and he calls out to the city, and he warns them, and they do nothing, they don't listen to him, they're going to die or be captured. It's not the watchman's fault. But now if he sees this invading army and he does nothing, he says nothing, he doesn't want to pester these people, he doesn't want to disrupt their day, they are going to die or be captured. And it's his fault. And the message that God gives to Ezekiel is you preach the word. And there may be people that don't listen to you, and they continue in their sin, and they're going to be judged and punished for that. But you'll be innocent. He says, but if you hold back, if you don't teach what I tell you to teach, if you're afraid of these people or you don't teach these words, they're going to persist in their sin, and they're going to be judged, and they're going to be punished for their sins. And he says, and I'm going to require their blood from your hands. I think that's a very important message for us today, especially as church leaders. And even as church members, I want us all to remember sometimes when an elder or teacher or someone maybe rebukes us or tells us we can be doing better, you remember this as well. We need to all remember this when it's our time to get confronted. That's important to do. And when a leader is doing that, one, they are showing that they love you enough to correct you. Two, they're getting the blood off their hands. I think it was Homer Gay, one of the old-time preachers, who I've heard other preachers talk about, took this very seriously. He was always concerned with getting the blood off his hands. He was going to teach the truth, and it was up to the people he taught whether they listened to it or not. They may get mad at him or not, but he didn't want to appear before God with the blood of people on his hands because he had held back and not taught the word. It's an amazing attitude, and it's one that we should all have. I know it's easy for us to see problems and think, I don't want to drive people away. I don't want to upset people. And we have to use wisdom, and we have to do things in love. But what a frightening reminder from Ezekiel that when we have that attitude, we may be letting people be lost. God's going to require that from our hands one day. I encourage you, like I said, to go and read those chapters in more fullness. But also something strange that I mentioned comes up here is there is a scroll that's given to Ezekiel, and it's written on the front and it's on the back, and it says that it's all the woes and mournings. It's probably all of the sins that Judah and Israel have committed, and he's told this vision to eat the scroll. Well, that sounds unpleasant, to eat this piece of parchment that's been written on, but he is supposed to eat and ingest this word. And he says that when he does, he's surprised to find that it was sweet as honey when he ate it. I think this is an attitude, and there's different ideas about all the symbolism of the scroll and its meaning, but I think there's one lesson that can be learned. These were the words of God about a terrible situation. Words of warning, words of judgment, words of woes. And yet because it is the word of God, it is sweet and precious. We all love those portions of the Bible that are uplifting, that are encouraging, that are comforting. We find them as sweet and nurturing to the soul. But those passages that warn us and rebuke us, scare us, don't forget they are just as much the Word of God as the other parts. And they are just as important for the ultimate salvation of our souls. And so Ezekiel is called in these chapters, And at the end of them, he goes to that city Tel Aviv, and it says that he sits there stunned for 7 days. For 7 days, he can't do anything, just sits there. Now, I imagine this is probably when a reputation for Ezekiel begins that probably follows him through his life. I want you to imagine that in your city, maybe people of Tel Aviv knew Ezekiel before or not, but some preacher comes and he sits down and he looks dazed for an entire week. You kind of go and you wave at him and he doesn't do anything. You poke him a bit and he doesn't respond. You say, "Are you okay, sir?" And he just doesn't say anything. That's really strange. And day 2 goes by. For 7 days, he doesn't do anything. How strange would that have been? Well, that was just the start. Because then we get into what I would call the sights and signs and sermons of Ezekiel. Now, these chapters contain all sorts of warnings about coming judgment. And one thing that's amazing about Ezekiel is he is certainly not a one-talented man when it comes to getting a message across. God wouldn't let him just use one method. He didn't just preach sermons. He didn't just do one thing. He acted out certain things, as we'll see. And then there were some things that were given to him by visions that he had to tell the vision. And then sometimes he would tell parables. And sometimes he would tell just straightforward sermons. So he uses all of these methods at his disposal, and God uses all of these methods to try and get across his message. And so in chapters 4 through 24, we see these. And we'll talk about a few of them. Chapters 4 and 5 begin some of the symbolic acts. We'll go through this kind of quick because Cecil talked about this a bit on Sunday morning. But I want you to try and imagine being the city, the townspeople that watched Ezekiel do this. Ezekiel's told to go find a brick. And on this brick, he's supposed to carve basically a picture or a map of Jerusalem. And then he's supposed to set it there, and he's supposed to set up things that make it look like a siege. Basically, he is acting out a siege of Jerusalem on this brick. But then, as if it wouldn't be strange enough to see a 30-year-old man basically play acting some type of military campaign out in the dirt, he's told to lay down on his left side for 390 days. And I haven't seen anything that really indicates this is metaphoric, that this is allegorical. In fact, it seems to be real because God even says that he will bind Ezekiel so that he can do this. And this man lays down on his left side for over a year around this little play siege of Jerusalem. And while he's doing this, he's told to drink water and to eat bread that's kind of a measly portion, and he's to cook it over a dung fire. Now, initially, it's supposed to be human dung, but Ezekiel cries out that he's never eaten anything unclean, and so God kind of acquiesces and he says, you can use cow dung. But he has to have this fire as he's laying there. He must prepare this fire, and that's how he's going to eat for 390 days, laying on his left side, drinking water and eating meals prepared over cow dung. Now, I want you to imagine watching that for a year. You'd think, this guy's insane. This guy's crazy. Well, then when the 390 days are done, he's supposed to switch over and he lays on his right side for 40 days. And God speaks about those days being representative of the years of the punishment, and there's different ideas about that. But whatever that specific symbolism is, obviously the people are wondering what in the world is going on with Ezekiel. And then finally, at the end of this, he's supposed to take a sword as sharp as a razor and to cut off his hair. But then he's supposed to cut that hair up into 3 portions. And a third of that hair he's supposed to take and he's supposed to burn it with a fire. And a third of the hair he just casts up to the wind, and of course the wind just blows that hair all over the place. And then a third of the wind, he takes that sword or that razor and he just chops it up even more. And of all those hairs, just a few pieces he's supposed to take and weave into the fabric of his robe. And then finally at the end of this, probably at the end of this whole scene, this over a year scene, God says what it all means. Jerusalem will be besieged. Now, this is still years away from the actual siege, but Nebuchadnezzar is going to march against the city and he is going to besiege it. And it is going to be devastating. The people will probably think that a meal of water and bread cooked over a dung fire would be a luxury. And then ultimately the end result is there's going to be a lot of people that literally die in the fires of the city. And there's going to be a lot of people that are struck down with the swords of the Babylonians. And then there's going to be a lot of people that are dispersed amongst the nations or sent off into captivity or sold into slavery. That's the future of God's people. But remember those hairs that were tucked in and interwoven with the robe. Even in all of this loss, there are still those who are faithful to God. And God will keep them close to himself through all of this. These are the signs that Ezekiel begins to show. But then in chapter 6 and 7, he moves to prophecy, but it's kind of a strange prophecy because he's told to go and prophesy against the mountains of Judah. So he's not talking to people. He's now preaching to inanimate objects, to nature. But obviously they are symbols for the people. And perhaps the reason that he is condemning these mountains is because where is it that the Israelites and the Jews had so frequently practiced their idolatry? On the high places, on every high hill, up on these mountains where they had committed so much various forms of idolatry. And so God sends him with messages of judgment that's spoken against these mountains, that is a judgment against the people. Now something happens in this section. This happens all through Ezekiel, but especially here. He talks of this coming judgment. And then God says, then you will know, or then they will know, I am the Lord. Again and again and again, God says that. God says there's coming a day when the people who say God doesn't see, the people who say God doesn't care, the people who say God has abandoned us, people that say Ezekiel's a crazy man. He says there's coming a day when they will know I am the Lord. The problem is when that day comes, it will be too late. Judgment will have already come. Obviously, there is a great parallel for us to be wary of here. There is coming a day, as we're told in the New Testament, when every knee will bow, when every tongue will confess. There is coming a time when all creation will know and acknowledge that God is the Lord. But if you have not bowed the knee, confessed the name of Christ, and been faithful to him until that day, then that day will be too late, just as it was for Judah so long ago. Then as we continue in chapters 8, there's a new vision. And this vision, this time, God takes Ezekiel and via a vision, he transports him to Jerusalem. And I think the things that he sees while in a vision are actual things that are happening in the city of Jerusalem. Now, God has already been seeing some harsh things and some terrible judgments. And Ezekiel and the exiles and people back in Jerusalem may be thinking, is that really fair? Is that really what God should do? God takes Ezekiel and he shows him some things. First of all, through chapter 8, we see 4 scenes of abominable idolatry. First, he is taken and he sees at the gate of the temple what is called an idol of jealousy. Now, that's kind of vague and probably intentionally. We don't know who the specific idol was for. What we know is that some people had literally set up an idol there in the gates of the temple itself. Surely this must have been revolting to a man who wanted to be a faithful priest. Right there in God's house, they're worshiping false gods. And God says to him, you think this is bad? I'm going to show you some more abominable things. So he, in this vision, tells Ezekiel to dig through a wall. And as he does, he finds this room. And in this room, there's these carvings and these paintings of beasts and creatures and idols and false gods. And he sees none other than the elders of Israel worshiping and leading in idol worship. And also these elders are declaring that Yahweh does not see. They declare that Yahweh has forsaken them. And so they are bowing down and worshiping these false images. God says, you think this is bad? I have more. So he takes him from there and he shows him at another gate what is said to be women weeping for Tammuz. Probably not saying that name right, but that is a Mesopotamian agricultural goddess. And the reason they're weeping for her is, we apparently know some of this from history. In this specific Mesopotamian religion, this Tammuz was the wife of Ishtar. And it was believed that every harvest season, around the fall and winter time, she died. And then in the springtime, she revived or resurrected. But during that time of harvest, at the end of that, and to that time, the women of these cult religions would mourn the death of this Tammuz. And there's Jewish women caught up in this. Also, the fact that these other things we've seen we know from other passages and other places in the Old Testament, Canaanite idolatry was often common. They're pulling from religions as far away as Mesopotamia. They're letting any and every religion in the world come and permeate God's holy city. God says that's not it. He takes him just outside the temple. And there we're told that Ezekiel sees 25 men with their backs to the temple worshiping the sun, as if they have turned their back on God, the Creator, to bow down and worship the creation. All of this is taking place in God's city. All of this is taking place within the gates of God's temple. What a sad and dejecting condition. Now, before we move on from that, I want to say we may look at that and think, how tragic, how disgusting. I wonder if we were able to be taken on such a journey of the church today. If we were able to see all that God sees, what might our eyes be open to? Would we see hidden sins of immorality? Would we see people living out lives of greed and covetousness? Would we see people committing idolatry of various forms as they put other things before God? Things that maybe we never see. What might we see? What might we be involved in if all was exposed? We should learn the lessons of warning, especially when you consider what happens next. After showing Ezekiel these things, in chapter 9, he sees 6 men called forth and a scribe. And God tells the scribe to go throughout the city, to start at the temple. And anyone who groans or sighs over all of these abominations, that is, anyone who's distressed and upset about all the idolatry, he says, you put a mark on their foreheads. And as he goes and the scribe does this, he tells the other 6 men, he says, you go and you kill everybody that doesn't have the mark. He says, you don't show pity, whether they're old or young, whether they're men or women. You go slay the people. In fact, in one of the most haunting verses, in verse 7 of chapter 9, God says, defile the house and fill the courts with the slain. Now, this was a picture of what God's judgment was going to be, but how horrific for Ezekiel to see the temple so defiled by idolatry, and then to see the result. Basically, God said, you have defiled this house through rebellion. Now it will be defiled with death. And of course, that's what was going to happen in the city of Jerusalem. But then the greatest tragedy happens in chapters 10 and 11. As Ezekiel is there in Jerusalem, he sees these cherubim again. This time they lift up from the temple. And the Spirit of God is above them. And they depart to a mountain just east of the city, probably the Mount of Olives. And it pauses for a bit as judgments are pronounced upon the rulers of Israel. And then the presence of God is gone. God's presence has left his dwelling place, his city. God is opening the doors for Babylon to come in and destroy Jerusalem. There's much more we could say about the glory of God departing the temple, but let's move on to their chapters 12 through 24. We're just going to mention these. We're not going to get to go through them in detail. But here we see more acts. Ezekiel pretends to go into exile. We see him told to eat while shaking and trembling, because that's how the people back home were going to be eating. At the end of this section in chapter 24, his wife dies, as I mentioned earlier, and the way he responds is meant to be an object lesson. But then he also tells sermons and parables. It's one of the few other places other than Jesus where lessons are taught in parables. And I'll encourage you to go and find these. He tells parables of the vine. He tells a parable of these eagles and picking up a vine. Now there's one that he talks about. I think this is around chapter 18, but you'll have to find it for sure, where he speaks of a parable, but he likens Israel to basically a young orphaned girl, a baby, that God raises and then later marries. And if you read that chapter, it's one of the probably strangest, most difficult chapters, and it's an offensive chapter, to be honest. It uses some of the most graphic language in the Bible, and it's meant to shock you. And one, it sounds strange to our modern ears for sure. It was meant to sound strange to their ears as well, because God is showing the grotesque behavior and unfaithfulness of Israel. As you read those chapters, you will be uncomfortable. And you're meant to be, because that's a picture of how terrible sin is. That's how Ezekiel preached this message. Then there are some that are just straightforward sermons. They're not parabolic. They don't take any special interpretation. There's just some straightforward messages. He gives them history lessons, reminding them of their past rebellion. He teaches them a lesson. This is in chapter 18 about personal accountability. They had said there was kind of this proverb, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and our teeth are set on edge. Basically, they're saying, this is unfair. We're being punished for our father's sins. And God says, don't say that proverb anymore. Yes, they were suffering some of the consequences, but he says, you're being punished for your sins. They weren't any better than their fathers. And God teaches a message in that chapter. It's a very relevant passage. God says, I take no delight in the loss of the wicked. God didn't want to punish you. He wasn't sitting up there gleeful that he was raining down this destruction. It broke his heart to do this. But he is a just and a holy God, and he will judge sin. And every one of us will be accountable for our actions. We'll go through the next section very quickly. After these messages of judgment, chapters 25 through 32, Ezekiel has messages for many of the foreign nations. I'm just going to point out, you'll notice that while there's several in chapter 25, there's a prolonged section about Tyre. And then there's another prolonged section about Egypt. And so those are specially focused on in Ezekiel's prophecy. But then after this, in chapter 33, we find a messenger comes and says that Jerusalem has fallen. A devastating day for the exiles, those who were clinging to some false hope that the exile would be over and they'd get to go home. And then a messenger comes. Zedekiah has been captured. They slaughtered his sons in front of his eyes, and then they put his eyes out. They destroyed the temple. There is no more temple. And they burned the city of Jerusalem to the ground. There is no home anymore. Everything now is lost. And it's at this point that Ezekiel is reaffirmed once again as a watchman and calls Judah to repentance. And from this point, he begins speaking messages of newness. There's a rebuke of the bad shepherds that Israel had had, but a promise of a new shepherd. There's this promise of restoration, the valley of dry bones, of two sticks that are bound together, showing the unification of Israel and Judah as God's people. Chapters 38 and 39 are difficult chapters, but they're a prophecy against this Gog of Magog. But you may recognize those terms from Revelation. And it seems to be a prophecy against this group that opposes God and opposes God's people. But it's a message of, much like Revelation, of God's ultimate victory. And so we have all these messages of hope, of a future. And then the final picture of hope comes in the last several chapters, chapters 40 through 48. And by this point, this has been 20 years later since he was first called as a prophet. He's taken back via vision to Jerusalem, and he's shown from a high setting a construction of a new temple and a new city. And if you read these chapters, you'll probably yawn a lot. And you'll think, why do I need to know these measurements of a temple? Why do I need to know about these chambers where priests can change clothes and priests can eat, and this altar and where that piece of furniture goes? But I want you to think about Ezekiel. What picture of hope would have been better for this man who was supposed to be a priest and it was ripped away from him to get to see a perfect temple, to get to live out his dream, in a sense, of being in God's temple? Now, there's a lot of ideas about this temple. Some believe that this was supposed to be the temple, but obviously when you read about the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra and Nehemiah, it doesn't come close to what's described in Ezekiel. And so some think that the Jews just didn't live up to the expectation, and so it didn't get as grand as it should have. Others think that this is a still yet future temple. It's going to be in the millennial reign of Christ, premillennialism theology. When Christ returns, that this temple will be rebuilt and there will be sacrifices offered again as a memorial of what Jesus did. I don't believe that for a second. I think that's a false doctrine. Others believe it's a picture of the church and the Messianic age. And I think that third option is probably our best, but especially God is simply giving to Ezekiel a message of hope and a message of restoration. And what better picture of hope for this priest than this temple? By the way, much of this language will be borrowed or used by John as he describes the New Jerusalem at the end of Revelation. He'll use some of the exact same ideas. Now, there's going to be some big differences. For example, in John's New Jerusalem, there is no temple because he knew Jesus. And Jesus was there. So there doesn't need to be a temple. But that's not a contradiction from Ezekiel's vision, because after all of those long chapters and details, it all boils down to one simple sentence, the final verse of Ezekiel's prophecy. The circumference of the city shall be 18,000 cubits, and the name of that city from that time on shall be the Lord is there. And that's exactly what John says in Revelation. The final picture of restoration and hope and life is that we will be with God and He will be with us. That's the vision of Ezekiel. I'm out of time, but I do want to mention one quick lesson. I knew I wouldn't have time to go through a bunch, and there's a lot of themes and a lot of lessons, so I encourage you to go and read the book of Ezekiel and find some of those. I may do some more teaching on Ezekiel in the future, but I want to say this from the book of Ezekiel. That is simply this: do the work of the Lord. Life doesn't always go the way you plan, the way you want. It definitely didn't go the way Ezekiel. And yet, he was far more effective, I'm sure, as a prophet in exile than he would have been as a priest back in the corrupt city of Jerusalem. Sometimes our lives don't pan out the way we want them to, the way we think they're going to, the way we think they should. Don't let that discourage you. Just continue working for God. Recognize that faithfulness may be difficult. Think of Ezekiel's life. Think of the things he was supposed to do. He had to lay on his side for over a year. He had to eat food made over a dung fire. He had to make sure he didn't cry when his wife died. He had to do all sorts of hard things. Following God isn't always easy. But do the work anyways. And realize that people may not listen or respond. They certainly didn't for Ezekiel. God even told him from the beginning, he said, I'm going to have to give you a hard forehead because the people you're talking to are so stubborn and rebellious. They may listen, they probably won't. But he said, you go preach anyways. This should never be an excuse for not doing the work. It should be an encouragement to do the work. Sometimes we don't see the results we want. Sometimes we preach and people don't obey. Sometimes we rebuke and we exhort. We do so with love and we do so with zeal, and people leave anyways. Sometimes we do everything we can possibly imagine to get people out of their lukewarmness, and they just stay content in their spiritual lethargy. And it's very discouraging. One of the great lessons of Ezekiel is don't let it discourage you. You just do your job. You do your job. God will reward you one day. And who knows how many people you will have effectively helped. I don't know how many people, if any, ever listened to Ezekiel's prophecy. But he has now impacted people across thousands of years through the work that he did as God's prophet. Because despite his circumstances, despite his hardships, despite the initial appearance of ineffectiveness, he stood in the gap, he stood on the wall, he watched and he warned, and he worked for the Lord. And that's a call for each and every one of us to learn from that great example and to do the same in our Christian walk.